of like, oh, good. I hope you don't stump me on something.
No. I got they're super easy questions. So
Okay.
let's start with an easy one. Let's get some background on how you ended up getting started working with Nickelodeon and on Are You Afraid of the Dark. How did it all come about for you?
Well, the kind of brief, long story is after I went to NYU Film School and with the idea of being a writer and a director and all that kind of stuff. And one of the things I say to kids at schools is that, if you're whatever you're doing that's creative, the bad news is you can't necessarily choose what it's going to be. It's got to be what comes out of you. And I love telling the story. I hope it's true because it sounds good. But somebody once asked Stephen King why he writes horror stories, and his answer was, "I don't know. That's what comes out." And it's true. So when I got out of school, I wanted to be a writer, and I'm writing all these deeply dramatic, important, like movies that win Oscars and whatnot, and they all sucked. It was horrible, and I'm ready to give up until a friend of mine said, "Do you ever think about writing for kids?" And I was like, "No, who am I, Dr. Seuss? I'm not going to write for kids." But when I turned my brain that way to say I write for kids, suddenly the floodgates opened up. And I was living in Connecticut and New York at the time, New York City, and a lot of kids' TV production was centered out of there. The ABC after school specials and I did young people specials and all that kind of stuff. So that's where the opportunities were. So I wrote a number of ABC after school specials, which are before your time. You don't remember those things. You probably know the people making fun of them now. That's
I do. I was born in the 80s, so.
Yeah, that was the tail end of I wrote one of the 20th anniversaries episodes of that thing. That's how long they were around. And I wrote this one that was pretty decent, relatively speaking. And a guy I knew or a guy I met was producing a TV series for HBO. It was the adaptation of Encyclopedia Brown Boy Detective books for HBO. And he had seen one of my ABC after school specials, and he said, "Ooh, I bet that guy can write these things." I don't know how he made the connection, because the after school special was like a really dramatic, heartfelt, separation of church and state kind of thing. And he's doing this goofy detective show with a kid. I don't know how he made that, but he was right, by the way. So his name was Ned Candle. And so I wrote the episodes of that show for him. And making a very long story short, once we finished that series, we thought, we could do this ourselves. So he said, "Have any ideas?" And I said, I'd like to do scary, I'd like to do bedtime stories for little kids. And the idea was, it wasn't even a TV show at first. It was let's get like some old guy actor with a big book that said fairy tales on it. We'd sit him in front of a fire and he'd read these things, and we'd record them and sell them and make $1 million. Where we hit the wall was when we didn't know what stories to do. Like Three Little Pigs. Like, it's not fun. So Ned asked me, he said, "What stories did you like when you were a kid?" And I said, "I like scary stories." Like, ooh, scary stories. So fairy tales became scary tales. The old guy went away, and we said, "Well, we don't want the storyteller to be scary. So what?" He said, "Oh, we tell stories around a campfire. Kids tell stories around a campfire." So suddenly the old guy goes away, the campfire comes in, and we're like, "Well, why do we just tell the stories? Why don't we show the stories?" Which made the budget go whoop through the roof. We said, "This is a TV show. This isn't a made cheapy direct to video kind of thing." So that's when we went to Nickelodeon, and so we had this thing, and that's the decades long story in a nutshell of how I got to do kid stuff and Are You Afraid of the Dark in particular.
That's wild, man. That's really cool. And obviously on the show, you wore a ton of hats. You were a writer, you director, executive producer. I guess, how was it for you kind of juggling all those different tasks?
It was the best and hardest job I've ever had, especially in the first season, because first seasons of any kind of show, or you're just trying to figure out how to do it, and there's a lot of figuring out going on. And there was also an added kind of complication to the whole thing, is that we shot the show in Canada. We shot it in Montreal. In Montreal, it's pretty much French Canadian.
Sure.
So the majority of our crew were English second language people. French was their number one language. Not only, pardon me?
I said I was wondering about that, if it was shot in Canada.
Yeah, it was shot in. I mean, the reason it was shot in Canada is Nickelodeon. This is kind of a funny story where we were ready to go. We developed the whole show with Nickelodeon. That's great. That's great. And they called us in for a meeting, and we're like, yeah, we're going to get the green light to go to a pilot. It's great. And they said to us, yeah, we really want to do your show. We're like, okay, great, fine. She says, but we don't want to pay for it. Like, oh, really? Really? So we'll pay for half of it. But we only want to pay for half of it. So if you can come up with the other half of the money, we'll make the show. So Ned, my partner, who's a brilliant guy, great businessman, he found this Canadian company to say, will you pay for half the show? And the way it works out is Nickelodeon gets domestic rights for their half, and the Canadian company got to distribute it through the rest of the world. But with that money came caveats. One is we had to shoot in Canada. That was one of the big caveats. So I mean, there's a lot more to it than that, but that's the main reason why we shot in Canada. But we're shooting in Montreal, which is French Canadian, and it's very much of a French culture. So I will say that a lot of the look of the show came from Raoul Prue as our production designer. He was a very French Canadian guy, and the whole French kind of sensibility is very different than the typical U.S. mid-America kind of thing. So a lot of the weird look and the style and the costumes and the sets and whatnot came from that kind of French sensibility. That's one of the things that made Are You Afraid of the Dark kind of unique, was Rial's sensibility. But he spoke French, and I don't speak French. So it was very difficult in the beginning to kind of get everybody up to speed as to what I had in my head. A great example was, I forgot what script it was, but I wrote in the script that whoever the character was walked into the room, and the room was turned upside down. Now, to an American, that means it was a mess. You know, the room was turned upside down. That was my shorthand way of saying it. And Rial just looked at this thing like, oh, DG, because that's how you say DJ in French. Sure. DG, I can't budget. I can't turn the room upside down. I'm like, what do you mean? Just throw some stuff around. And he goes, what? He thought I literally wanted to move the room upside down. So he's thinking of putting chairs on the ceiling and whatnot. I'm like, no. So there was a lot of that going on, especially in the first season. And I wrote most of the episodes. I directed most of the episodes. I lost a lot of weight in that first season. So that was a long answer to your how was it juggling all that. And it was really, really hard, but really, really rewarding and a lot of fun. So the bottom line is it was a lot of fun. And I got my gray hair doing all of it.
So I guess, how did you choose which episodes for you to direct? I mean, how did that come about? Because I know you directed a bunch of them.
Yeah.
Throughout the seasons.
Well, that's a good question. In the beginning, I had this kind of self-imposed rule, which was any episode that I wrote from the ground up. I mean, I wrote or rewrote every episode. I worked with all the writers. That's what a showrunner does in TV. They work with the writers and develop it, so it kind of looks like the show. Yeah. But from the ground up, I wrote a lot of episodes too. If you ever see an episode written by Chloe Brown, that's me.
Oh, okay.
Which is a whole nother story. So Chloe Brown wrote maybe 20 episodes, I think. So meaning Chloe Brown, or I wrote the episode from the ground up. It was my idea, and I wrote it all myself. So I had this rule that I'd say, of any episode that I wrote from the ground up, I don't want to direct that. I want to have another director direct that, because I want to have another person's input on that to make it better. So I ended up directing all the episodes I didn't write, not counting the pilot in the first season, but of all the episodes I directed in the first season, I didn't write from the ground up any of those episodes. And a funny thing kind of happened. I don't know what order you've been binging the shows, but
order.
In order. Okay, so maybe you'll appreciate this. In that first season, I mean, talk about you have to write what comes out. My sensibilities, if you've read my books or whatever, I write guy-centric kind of adventure stories. And but I didn't want all these. This series wasn't called "Are You Guys Afraid of the Dark?" It's "Are You Afraid of the Dark?" So I wanted to get a variety of episodes. So the episodes that I didn't write, I brought on a lot of woman writers to get a whole different sensibility to have a balance of types of episodes. And because I wasn't directing the episodes that I wrote, a fellow by the name of Ron Oliver directed most of my episodes, and I directed all the other episodes. So while Ron is directing Laughing in the Dark about the guys that go in and steal the nose off of Zebo, and the Phantom Cab where they find Dr. Fink in the forest, and all these kind of the Dark Music where the kid finds some monster in his basement that he's feeding the bully to, you know, these kind of guy adventurous things. I'm directing The Lonely Ghost about a girl who's stuck next door and has to live with her cousin, and the girls who the hungry hounds are, they're the spirit of their dead grandmothers. And so I'm directing all these things. About halfway through the season, I'm like, what the heck? I'm directing all these girls' stories, and I'm trying to get girls to act like girls, which I'm not. I think I did okay, but it's really weird. And there was a funny thing that happened that at the end of the season, Ron, who directed a lot of the episodes, was really instrumental in the show. He did a really nice thing. He got gifts for the entire crew, and he got these dog tags. He made dog tags for everybody on the crew, and the dog tags had the name of the show and the year, their name, and what their job was. So it would say Fred, camera operator, or Anik, makeup. Mine said DJ, girl director. So wait a minute. So as early as season 2, I threw my rule out the window and said, I'm going to start directing the things that I write too. So that was kind of how it changed. And the first season was very, very different, where I did not direct the things that I wrote. From season 2 on, I pretty much directed the things I wrote. So that's how I chose it,
Cool.
more or less.
That's cool, man. So I guess what would you say is some of your biggest challenges working on the show? Was it just working in Canada? Was that did that answer it before, or?
I mean, the challenge on this show is the same as probably most any show. And it comes down to budget and time, because time equals money. It goes back to budget again. So we didn't have a huge budget on the show. And as much as you could look at the show and, oops, I'm going to close that out. As much as you could look at the show at some point and say, oh, that's kind of cheesy. Yeah, it was, but we tried to do the best we could on a low budget. And one of my mantras was, let's not reach for something and fail. Let's make sure that whatever we reach for, we know we can accomplish, so it will look good. I'd rather have a little lesser look. And I'm talking about production design and effects and all that kind of monsters. So budget was always a challenge. I will say that one of the great things of the show that made that easy was that this French-Canadian crew are the most dedicated, talented people in the world. So guys like Real, who I said, who could make something out of nothing. He's like that chef who would look in a refrigerator and see a rotten egg, a crust of bread, and a celery stick, and make some great meal out of it. So he would do that. The makeup artist, who was on all 90 episodes, she wasn't on the pilot, she was on 90 of the episodes, did all those makeup designs. I mean, this is a woman who really didn't have that much experience to begin with, but she was so dedicated to the show. She'd be baking vampire teeth in her oven at home and making ears and teeth, and it looked phenomenal. So we had such a dedicated crew that helped me with the challenge of a budget, but made it look so much better. So that really was and also the challenge of writing scripts that were doable. Sure. You could write whatever you want to write, but you got to be able to pull it off too. So that's really what the main challenge. And you can say that in some way, shape, or form about every TV show, unless they're some big network, money's no object show. But for a show like us, we really had to scrimp and save. Do we really need film for this episode? It was that kind of level of, quite that bad, but that's the level we operated on. So that was probably the biggest challenge.
What would you say was some of your favorite episodes? And anything you could come up with?
Yeah, it's fun for me because, and you probably fit into this category, that and it's been for a while now, but the 90s is such a huge nostalgic boom now. and for me, it was last week, but for people in their 30s, it's like, oh, remember we were kidding. People in their 30s are starting to sense their own mortality, which is when you start looking back on the good old days.
Sure.
And because of that, it's funny. You when you work on a show, it's a job, and you love it, and you do the best you can. Then it's over, and you don't think that 20 years later you're going to be talking about it. And with Are You Afraid of the Dark, Mike, I'm telling you, I'm not exaggerating when I say there isn't a day that goes by that I don't interact with someone in some way, shape, or form about Are You Afraid of the
Wow.
Dark? And so it's fun for me to like see stuff online and whatnot, and what people's favorite episodes are, because you asked me about favorite episodes,
Sure.
and a lot of time, and I have a completely different perspective because I bring way too much baggage to it. So when I think of what my favorite episode is, forget, I mean, certainly creativity goes into it, but I think of all the nightmare of making that episode. I'm like, oh my God, you know, and I'll give you an example. I see a lot of people writing about how their favorite episode was, I don't know if you've gotten this far on your binge yet, but The Tale of the Pinball Wizard.
That was my number one choice. I have it written down here.
Okay, let me give you my perspective on that. We made 91 episodes of that show. That was the single most difficult episode to do, because talk about biting off more than you could chew.
Wow.
It was a way too big of an episode for the little tiny show that we did. It was way too ambitious, and it was the only episode that took us an extra day to shoot, because there was just so much that we had to shoot. I directed that episode, actually.
Right.
It was a night. Oh my God, it was a nightmare. And also, remember, we shot that thing at night in a mall, and so we would come to work while the mall is closing up for the day, shoot through the night. And I always remember that we knew that I was running out of time when I started hearing the birds chirp in the morning, because birds are always like an hour before sunrise, and I'm like, oh, hurry up. And we would be wrapping up as people were opening up their shops the next day. It was a nightmare of a shoot. So when people say to me that's their favorite episode, maybe it's a good thing, like, thank God it was worth it, because that was a nightmare.
Yep.
So a lot of my favorite episodes are ones, not necessarily because they're the best episode or whatever, but it's because something about it I really love. I mean, I'll share one story with you that only because my favorite episode is The Tale of the Midnight Madness. That was my favorite episode, and again, not because I think it was the best episode we did. It was up there, but it was because it was the beginning of the second season, and suddenly we were starting to hit our stride. And language wasn't as big a problem anymore, because I was actually picking up some French at this point. And so in my mind, it was the first time that we were hitting on all cylinders. And it's like, that's the kind of show we can make. So I have a special place in my heart for that episode.
Sure.
But one of my absolute favorite episodes is an episode that no one cares about, that no one remembers, because there's no monster in it. There is no, usually people go, oh, Zebo the Clown. There was no iconic, scary monster that came out of the pool kind of thing.
Sure.
But it's one of my favorite episodes for a lot of reasons. And it was, I forgot what season it was, season 4 maybe, where at the beginning of the season, I wouldn't hire writers. I didn't have a writer's room. I was the writer's room. What I would do is I would buy scripts. So people would pitch me script ideas, and if I liked it, I would have them then write the script. So it was all freelance people who wrote the episodes. And a fellow by the name of Jerry Wexler, who wrote a number of episodes, pitched this idea to me at the beginning. And so usually I'd start writing a couple months before we start shooting. So he pitched this idea to me, which I really liked. And I said, oh yeah, write the script. So he wrote the script, and I just loved the script. And I loved it so much that I wanted to direct it. And it was the season where we did Cutter's Treasure. I forgot what season that was.
That was 4.
So season 4. So Cutter's Treasure was going to kick off the season. I was going to direct that. And at this point, I was directing fewer episodes. So usually I kind of directed the first episode and the last episode of the season. So I knew I was going to do Cutter's Treasure at the beginning. So I thought, oh, I love this episode so much. We'll put it at the end of the season. We'll make it the last episode that I'll direct. So we developed this thing, wrote the script, and then I forgot about it. And then we went through the whole season, not only developing all the scripts and writing all the scripts, but then shooting all the scripts. And so this episode was so far out of my mind. what would happen with every episode is that a couple of weeks before we'd shoot an episode, whether I was in Montreal or I lived in Los Angeles, I'd get on the phone or have a meeting with my department heads to go through the next script, to say, okay, here's what I have in mind, go see what you can do with it, and kind of get them all on the same page. And it was 2 weeks before we shot this episode, and I pulled it out, dusted it off because I hadn't looked at it in 3 or 4 months. And I was so tired at this point. I was so burned out. I was not going to get on a plane to go back to Montreal to shoot this thing. So I started this conversation, this meeting, fully expecting to, at the end of the conversation, say, and we have to find a director to direct this thing because I am not coming back to town. I am burned out. I am done. Yeah. But it's testament to how much I love that show. I sat down to read, and I read the script aloud to them. By the time I finished reading the script, I remembered why I love the script. I remember why I love the show. And I was like, and I'll be back in town to direct this thing. That's how much. It's an episode called The Tale of Train Magic.
Okay.
It's about a little kid whose father died, who was a conductor on a railroad, and he had this model train set. It was about a haunted train that he ended up having to get on this haunted train. And I got to play, and I didn't even expect this to happen, but we found a freaking train museum outside of Montreal. I thought we were just going to dummy these things up. We had full-size trains that were moving around and being inside of it. It was so much fun to shoot, and it was such a fun episode, but it didn't have any monsters in it. It wasn't scary. It was just kind of Twilight Zone eerie. So in anyone's list of favorite episodes, that ain't on it. But it's one of my favorite episodes.
I'm on season 4 right now, so I'm going to keep a lookout for it.
Okay, it's the last episode of season 4. So I've now totally, I don't know if I've built it up or I've diminished it, but it is one of my favorite episodes.
That's great, man. And I was thinking, there isn't really shows like this for kids today. Can you, I don't know, like when I was a kid, I watched this show and it used to scare the living daylights out of me. And now, like, I have a kid of my own, and she's like, she's 8.
Yeah.
And so she's starting to watch things that I used to watch. And, but there isn't like a TV show like this for kids today,
Well, actually, believe it or not, there are. You just got to look for them. I mean, for the longest time, after I finished Dark, I would pitch similar shows, and networks were like, ooh, you can't do this. It's like, the pendulum always swings back and forth. And it went from kind of doing, kids TV went from doing kind of interesting variety of things to being all comedy. Not counting animation, but live action went to all comedy. And so the kinds of shows I did weren't really being done anymore. And you're right, for a while they weren't. And that's how I got into writing books, because if I wanted to write the kind of stuff that came out, I wasn't doing it on TV, I'd do it in books. But the pendulum swung back. And so there have been a lot of shows. You got to hunt for them. But those shows have come back a little bit. Believe it or not, a show that was not made for kids, but was embraced by kids, was that show Stranger Things on Netflix.
That's true.
They did not expect that to be a kids show. It wasn't intended to be a kids show, but kids found it.
I could see that being one of the shows. Yeah, I could see that. Down the line, I could see us talking about that as being one of the shows that that kids watch when they were younger. You're right. That's cool.
Yeah, and there were other kind of smaller shows that were on smaller networks you didn't see. Shows like I can't even think of names of them now. The Haunting Hour was one. Spooksville. Those shows have come out, but they haven't. They didn't really capture the imagination and capture the viewership that a show like like Are You Afraid of the Dark did on Nickelodeon, or Goosebumps did on Fox. So none became that big. You're right. None became huge like those shows, or like Are You Afraid of the Dark. But they're there. You just have to hunt the Haunting Hour. I forget.
I think that sounds familiar to me. Was that like an R.L. Stein thing?
Yeah.
That sounds familiar to me.
Yeah. So they're there, and so kids, the pendulum has swung back a little bit. So they rebooted Are You Afraid of the Dark?
That's actually going to be my next question. I wanted to talk to you about that. I wanted to know how you got involved with the 2019 miniseries reboot.
You're assuming I was involved.
Yeah,
I was not involved at all.
Not involved.
Other than the fact I created the show, I'm not involved at all.
Really? Cool.
Yeah, new people, new whatever. As to why I wasn't involved, you'd have to ask them. But yeah, but no. So I'm not involved with it. I saw it, but and it's good. It's good. It's okay.
It's not bad. It feels like it was like a movie that they kind of split into 3 episodes.
Yeah, I mean, I'm hesitant to criticize it because it's going to sound like sour grapes. I thought it looked great. Um, it was really slick, and I'm sure they didn't have a big budget either. I like the casting in the Midnight Society. You know, there's a lot. I like the whole um, becoming a member of the Midnight Society. That was kind of fun, all that kind of stuff. Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, it kind of gave it like a little more background to Midnight Society, and it was pretty cool.
Yeah, yeah, I thought it did. And they're going to make more. I think once this coronavirus, we get over that, I think they're going to make some more. So,
Right.
yeah, I was pleased. I didn't look. I wasn't embarrassed by looking at it.
Cool. Well, I didn't know you weren't involved. That's good to know.
Yeah,
So,
I mean, I created it, so we get credit and checks. But but Ned and I had nothing to do with the making of it. So if you really like it, you're welcome. We created a great show. If you hated it, hey, we had nothing.
me, hands up.
Yeah, right.
So another show we got from the '90s was Ghostwriter, right?
Uh-huh.
You were involved with some episodes of that. I guess how
Well,
did that come about?
that's kind of a fun thing in light of the fact that that's been rebooted too
See?
on Apple TV. The back when, so we're going back to set the Wayback Machine to 1990, 1991, I guess. Remember it saying how kids TV is made in New York, and I was still living in Connecticut, suburban New York at the time. And I forgot how it came about, but I got the gig to write really what was the pilot episode for Ghostwriter. It was, and the episodes were, or the stories were told in 4 episodes. So I wrote 4 episodes. They didn't call it the pilot episode because if they called it the pilot episode, then they would have had to pay me like it was a pilot episode. And I don't know if you know this, according to the Writers Guild, if you write the pilot to a show, you get created by credit.
Really?
Yeah, and I didn't create that show.
Sure.
It was Neil and created it. So, but they hired me. They had an idea for it. So I don't mind at all that I didn't get created by credit. I shouldn't have gotten created by credit. But I did. But it was the pilot. It was the first episode. They called it the test episode. But at the same time that I wrote that pilot, I had nothing to do with the production. I also wrote and produced the pilot to Are You Afraid of the Dark? And I also wrote and produced the pilot to a show called Crisscross, which was on Showtime.
Okay.
So in this around 1991, all 3 of those shows got produced. And you don't know once you make a pilot, you have no idea if the show is going to go to series or not. It's just end right there. So I was like, if I'm going to be serious about this TV thing, I've got to move to Los Angeles. So I moved to Los Angeles. All 3 shows got picked up. They asked me to come on Ghostwriter, but I preferred to be with the shows that I did create and produced. So I moved to Los Angeles. Then we produced Are You Afraid of the Dark in Montreal and Crisscross in Nottingham, England. So it's like, if I'd only stayed put for another couple of months, life would have been much easier than it turned out to be. So beyond writing the pilot for Ghostwriter, I didn't have anything to do with it. So now cut to years later, Apple TV Plus has decided to reboot Ghostwriter, and I have nothing to do with the production. But a friend of mine who is the head of Apple TV and Family, the concept of the new Ghostwriter is that there are these books that the kids get out of a special bookstore or whatever, and characters come out of the books into real life, and they have to solve a mystery to use it with the ghost to try to figure out how to get it back into the books. So what my friend said was, that's what we're going to do, and we're going to use some classic literature. We're going to do Alice in Wonderland. We're going to do the Jungle Book, but we want to get some original books too. So would you write a book for us? I was like, yeah. And it's funny when she asked me that, I don't think she even knew that I wrote the pilot to the original Ghostwriter. but I was like, yeah, sure. So for me, the cool thing about it is that when you see any promos for this Ghostwriter, you see these other books. You see Jungle Book by Rudyard Kipling. You see Alice in Wonderland by missing his name right now.
Lewis Carroll.
Lewis Carroll, thank you. Um, Trinity by DJ MacHale. What? It's like one of these things is not like the other, but it's kind of fun to be in that spoken about in the same breath as those three authors. So that's kind of fun, and they just dropped a couple of new episodes too, I think.
Yeah, I saw that. That's actually really cool. That's my next show. I'm gonna check out the new Ghostwriter. So that's definitely one of my next ones.
Yeah, it's fun. It's a real clever premise, and they did a good job too. Yeah.
So let's talk about how you went from TV to writing books like Pendragon, Journal of, Adventure Through Space and Time. Let's kind of dive back into the other section of you.
Well, that's it. I touched on it before. Is that when the pendulum of TV, kids TV in particular, swung away from what I was doing, and so I kind of saw the writing on the wall that if I want to continue writing the kind of stuff that I write, maybe books. And I had this idea for this story called Pendragon. And I sat down to outline it because I always outline my books. And in the process of outlining it, I realized, oh, this isn't one book. This could be a lot of books. This could be like 10 books. This could be a series. And so I wrote what is essentially the 60 pages of the first book, and then the whole Bible for what the whole thing was going to look like. And I really outlined all 10 books in one big package. And I went to my management company and I said, I want to write a book series. What do you think? And this guy said, this is the worst thing I've ever read. No one is ever going to want to read this. And you're ugly too. Didn't say that, but it felt like it. But I took my own advice that I always give to kids: you can't give up on things. So I was like, okay, thank you very much. Give me that back. And I went to like literally the next office over. And I was like, what do you think? And this guy read it and goes, oh, no, it looks pretty good to me, I suppose. He said, but I don't really know. I'm not an agent in literature, in books. So let me hook you up with a New York literary agent. Okay, fine. So we sent this package to this literary agent, fellow named Richard Curtis, and he read it and he gave me the exact right advice. He said, well, this has potential. This could be pretty good, but because you haven't written a novel before, you really need to write the whole thing. Because I've only written like 60 pages of the first book.
Sure.
And I didn't take his advice. I said, yeah, nah, if I take the time to write the whole thing, I'm going to care too much. And when it doesn't get published, I'm going to be really disappointed. So let's just see what happens. Let's just throw it against the wall and see what happens. Well, when people ask me, how did you get your first book published? Because they want to get their first book published. I was like, oh, it's actually pretty easy. If you follow these simple steps, you too can get your first book published. I said, first, create a hit TV show. That's easy. And then make sure that a spin-off book series is written from your TV show. And when that spin-off book series is written, work with the editor from that publishing house with that TV book series. So they know who you are and they get to know you. Because 5 years later, when you have your own book series, you can go back to that same editor and say, hey, remember me? We worked together. It went so well. Because they'll say, okay. And that's how it happened. We went back to the woman by the name of Lisa Clancy, who was the editor on the Are You Afraid of the Dark book series, who I worked with and helped with the books and whatnot. And we said, we have this idea. What do you think? And she's like, let's give it a shot. And it wasn't a big commitment on the publisher's point of view because it was just paperback only. They paid me like $1 as an advance. It wasn't a big risk on their part. And it took off. And so who knew? And by the time the fifth book came out, it became a #1 New York Times bestseller. And then they went to hardcover, which means I could finally make some money. and I've published 25 books since then, about 25 books, and spin-off series and new trilogies. And so it really came about because I saw the writing on the wall. The kids' TV was changing, and I wanted to keep writing the stuff I want to write. So I went into books. And so that's really how it came about.
Have you ever considered making Pendragon into like TV series or a
Oh, of course,
feature?
of course. I've been trying to pitch that as a movie or TV series forever. Why it hasn't happened, your guess is as good as mine, or I can only speculate. It's so big, and each book is completely different than the last. Because, for example, as big as Harry Potter is, you know, they're reusing a lot of the same stuff. And it's also Harry Potter. They've sold more books than the Bible, I think.
Sure.
So, and Pendragon is really successful, not on that level. So I've had a couple of deals, I've had a couple of options, and just we haven't put the right team together yet. I'm now exploring the possibility of doing it as an animated TV series,
That's cool.
which I mean, it's not my first choice, but it's not a bad choice, um, because it also opens up the world. Suddenly, budget, here we are, budget again. Budget isn't as big a factor, because when I was pitching, and I'm still pitching Pendragon as live action, I try to get people to forget books 2 through 10, like forget about those. Pretend like those don't exist. Don't look at those books.
Oh, look at
Just look at number 1, because if you start looking at 2 through 10, it's like, oh, how are we going to pull that off? That's crazy. So I've been trying for years, and one of these days it happens. But if it doesn't happen, that's okay too, because there are these great books that people are so talk about. Oh God, talk about Are You Afraid of the Dark every day? I talk about Pendragon every day too. So if I died tomorrow, there would be 2 things on my tombstone: Pendragon and Are You Afraid of the Dark? Which is actually kind of a cool idea. Are You Afraid of the Dark on your tombstone? I think. I think I'd like that.
That's pretty cool. So, one thing when I was doing some research was that for Pendragon, you kind of created like this whole new kind of terminology, like this whole new language. How did that, was that fun? Was that hard? Did that make it extra challenging or?
Yes, 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 and yes. It's all fun and challenge. Um, it wasn't so much a new language. I mean, in the first Pendragon, I had a little bit of a different language. It sounded kind of Klingon-like. But one of the things when you start writing about other worlds and other places and weird creatures and whatnot, you don't call the character Bill, or sometimes you do for fun. But so I would have to name other territories, and so the trick is to come up with something that doesn't sound hokey, um, but makes sense. So what I would do is, like for example, sometimes I'd be scientific about it. In one of the Pendragon books, they go to a territory called Chloral, and it's this water world that people live on floating. The cities are all these giant barges, high-tech barges, and so it's very much a water world, and they're underwater all the time. So I took 2 water words between chlorine and coral. I put them together and got chloral. So it's like it makes you think, like it puts in your head words that but it's really not that word.
Sure.
It's a little weird. That same book, the title of the book is The Lost City of Far. And so far implies far, it's far away, but I spelled it Faar. So, it gives you the feeling of the thing, but it feels a little bit weird. And then when I come up with names of people, my favorite story about a name I came up with was in one of the Pendragon books. I couldn't come up with a good name, but I didn't want to wait for days till I come up with a name. I had to keep writing. So whenever I wrote this character's name when I typed it, I put in parentheses name here, to be inserted later. Name here. So I'd say blah blah blah. Name here goes to the star. Blah blah blah. Name here talks to Bobby. Blah blah blah. Name here. So I got to the point. Eventually, I had to come up with the name. So I called him Alexander Namier.
That's it.
So his name here. That's how it is. So it's all sorts of fun things. With on less interesting but kind of fun level, you also have to name real characters, that aren't from planets elsewhere. So I'd often use names of my friends, which is a little risky, because just because you're using the name of your friend doesn't mean the character is like your friend. And to me it makes no difference, but to them they're like, hey, it's my name. But what? There was one. Well, there's a guy in the third Pendragon book, which takes place just before World War II. I named a character Donnie Schmid, of a guy I knew named Donnie Schmid. And but in the book, he's a Nazi scientist. And Donnie Schmid was like, you name me, you made me a Nazi scientist? I'm like, yeah, but it's not you. So you kind of have to be careful about what you do with people. So I'm using less names of friends for bad guys now. If they're nice people, I'll use the name of a friend, but I'm reluctant to use them for Nazi scientists again.
That's funny, man. That's great.
Well, you may have seen the thing, maybe this is where you got this from, but I had to do a Pendragon pronunciation guide online.
Oh no, that's awesome.
Oh, okay, yeah, because when you read something, especially when it's a wacky word, who knows how to pronounce it?
Sure.
It makes sense to me because it's phonetic or whatever. But so the publisher asked me, "Would you do a video Pendragon pronunciation guide?" So I went through the books up to that point. I went through the names that were a little wacky, and I pronounced them the way it should.
Oh,
So
awesome.
I thought maybe that's what you saw to say that I created new language.
That's cool though.
Yeah.
So, I think that's pretty much all I got. So, did I miss anything? Was there anything that you have upcoming that we could talk about, or that you're working?
I'm developing. Because the pendulum has swung back, I'm developing TV shows now. So
Great.
knock on wood, they'll get picked up. I'm doing a spooky show for adults, and I'm doing a couple of animated things, and all which won't see the light of day for a long time, but that's upcoming. Got a new book that I just finished that we're looking for a home, a publishing company as we speak. Screenplays I've written. So I've got a bunch of stuff in development, but if you know this business, it's like, that means nothing until something goes. But if people are interested in my books or whatever, they should go to my website, djmachalebooks.com, or look me up on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. I don't do Snapchat. That's the one. I draw the line at Snapchat. I'm way too old for that. I think you got to be like 17 or 12 to do that. After a certain age, once you can drink legally, you don't do Snapchat. Or what's the TikTok? Then you really got to be 12 to do that.
Yeah.
But the old fogey Facebook and Instagram and Twitter and the DJ MacHale books. So if you're interested in my books, go to that. I did a good job on the website because it shows all my books and it gives a little taste of each one. And there's a boatload of them, so there's a little something for everybody. So people should go and look at that.
That's cool. All right, cool. Listen, well, I appreciate the time and thanks again for the chat. All right.
Okay, Mike, my pleasure. Anytime.
All right, cool.